Hello, and welcome to 4 Random Books number 11. Now, sorry for the slightly delayed start, but I was trying to check. It was now 11 or 12. And I'm supposed to be recording Crete at the moment, but honestly, after last night, I don't feel like it. So, it's starting off with this, and it's a quasi-American theme. A sort of US Navy in the 20th century and a fun group to read. So I'm going to start off with Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Diplomacy. The US Navy and the Birth of the American Century. Written by Henry J. Hendrix. It's a good book. It's something I enjoy reading, and I could have got Theodore Roosevelt's own naval diplomacy book here out, this one, but I thought I would start off with Hendrix's introduction. Because Hendrix does a good job with this introduction. And it is rather an interesting approach. Let's see. Dewey confided to his journal that some of the evolutions were rather raggedly performed, owing to new ships having joined. I think angles and turning circles not yet having been determined. The after action report noted that the cruiser divisions were handled in connection with line of battle ships, without confusion and without the necessity of frequent signals or signaling at great distances. Captain Albert Greaves, the commanding officer of Dewey's flagship, the Mayflower, disagreed with that assessment. Greaves recorded in his memoirs an attempt to steam information from Culebra to St. Thomas that left an indelible image of a fleet without form and void, so to speak. Greaves felt that the ad hoc procurement practices of the Navy Department had resulted in such a multitude of ship designs and capabilities that the US Navy was practically unable to operate in formations beyond small groups of similarly designed ships. Following the winter exercise, an attempt was made to align the fleet in accordance with the ship's capabilities. In another departure from the norms of the day, Admiral Dewey directed that the reinforced Marine Battalion under command of Colonel Pope at Cuba dispatch landing parties to the eastern and western shores of Essex, to the Bay of Ensenada Honda, and to the northern shore of Puerto Rico. Those Marines left on Culebra, not tasked with logistical duties, were sent into their island jungles. These reconnoitring parties, each comprising an officer and 25 enlisted men and supplied with a week's worth of provisions, practiced armed reconnaissance, searching out possible enemy landing sites, and establishing defensive positions to repel the aggressive force. While the after-action report makes no mention of Venezuela, Dewey's involvement and the magnitude and realism of the Marines' activities indicate that this too was no mere exercise. Dewey's final report obliquely summarized the Marines' jungle training. These various exercises proved of conspicuous value to the officers and men engaged in them and gave us much valuable experience for later use. It's rather a fun little thing going on. And to be honest, this whole book is full of fun quotes and interesting stuff. It is a very good engagement with the context of what was being fought and what was being done, and what the US Navy was like in its genesis form. And please don't take this the wrong way. When I'm talking about US Navy genesis, I am not talking about their performance in the American War of Independence or even the American Civil War. You've got, to an extent, the Spanish American War, but honestly, it is not until later, in the run up to World War One and that sort of period, that you actually get the US Navy beginning to emerge, and the US Navy actually being let off the leash. In between all those periods, you've had consistent running down of the finances. You've had consistently the US Navy being almost ignored. Hence the ad hoc procurement practices, hence the ad hoc Navy they have and the Great White Fleet. But from this point onwards, they start to really develop into something. Yes, they still have hiccups and tribulations, but it's from this point onwards you have the nascent US Navy being formed, and that's why this book is so cool. So, Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Diplomacy by Henry J. Hendrix. You can't discuss the US Navy in the interwar years without this book, War Plan Orange, by Edward S. Miller. The US strategy to defeat Japan, 1897 to 1945. It is magnificent and massive. In 1910, the General Board had reflected that the Japanese could benefit from multiple combats. They might lose each battle, but could refit wounded ships at home base, whilst Blue, without a dockyard in the Western Pacific, would lose the war through cumulative mutilation. But American naval imaginations were obsessed by the dramas of Trafalgar, Tsushima, and Jutland. Besides a single battle, was a congenial planning assumption given the preponderance of US battleships always concentrated for action, with their numerical advantage augmented by the n squared law that combat effectiveness was proportional to the square of the number of guns in action. A ratio of 5 to 3, for example, translated in a 2.8 to 1 battle superiority and almost certain victory. Strategists did not concern themselves with battle tactics, which were the provenance of training, maneuvers, and war games. Such exercises sometimes rehearsed the Orange Plan scripts and at other times variant themes, including the interception of the USJF en route to the Philippines. Planners' opinions diverged as to the time and place of the clash. Some supposed it would occur early in Phase 3 near the western base. Others staged it would along the island ladder, until others at the end of the war off the coast of Japan. The university agreed that the Orange main body would not challenge the fleet's Pacific crossing during Phase 2, accepting the Guam lobby's assertion that a movement to a prepared base might draw out the main body. Frosters felt confident that Japanese dreadnoughts would not strike at a secret rendezvous in Micronesia or on the high seas, cavalier assumptions because destruction of the train would immediately stagger the United States into an ignominious retreat and perhaps cost it the war. Cautionaries believed the big orange ships would not venture so far afield as to oppose a blue occupation of the mandates. Not until 1941 did American planners develop a hypothesis of a mid-ocean battle. The Philippines were a popular combat milieu in plans before World War I. Analysts who projected a quick arrival and immediate forays by the Blue Fleet hoped to trap the Orange Navy at Luzon and whip it there perhaps as it scrambled to evacuate. The second committee speculated more grimly that the main body might intercept a blue expedition to the southern Philippines and sink the battleships after cruisers and torpedo craft had been scattered them. But the NWC plan of 1911 fixed the standard presumption that Japanese dreadnoughts would avoid their blue counterparts in the Philippines unless attrition attacks had taken a nasty bite, an assumption adopted, for example, in Op 12's Battle of Dumankis scenario of 1928. Basically, the Americans decided from very early on that they would out-dominate the Japanese and the Japanese would be forced to give ground. Beware, the enemy always has a vote. But that's War Plan Orange by Edward S. Miller. Turning the Tide, the Battles of Coral Sea and Midway. It's got a lot of different authors in here. It's edited Britannia Naval Histories of World War II, and it's a pretty cool book. But it's going to sound strange. It's sort of forward by Captain John A. Rogard, USN, introduction by P.D. Grove. These are the actual battle summaries as are compiled by the Royal Navy during World War II and updated. So these are the learning documents the Royal Navy produced. So they have lots of different authors writing bits of them. You can tell the different style of authorship of the different person writing, whether it's an intelligence officer, an engineering officer, what you can really do tell if you listen to their writing. But it's always interesting to actually read them because they're the Royal Navy's assessment of what happened. And their write-up of the actual history of how it happened. So here we go. Air battles of the 8th of May. Japanese carriers sighted. After the decision to defer action against the Zika and Shoko until daylight, Rear Admiral Fletcher continued to the southward during the night of the 7th of May, and at 0800 8th was in latitude 1425 S, long 154.31 E, course 125 degrees, speed 14 knots. The composition of his force being the carriers Yorktown, flagship, and Lexington, 5 cruisers Astoria, Chester, Portland, Minneapolis, and New Orleans, and 7 destroyers Phelps, Dewey, Alwyn, Morris, Anderson, Hellman, and Russell. The weather was fine, clouds few, wind from 0.85 degrees to 112 degrees. 16 to 20 knots, sea smooth, ceiling almost unlimited, but horizontal visibility somewhat restricted through haze. These conditions held with slight variations throughout the entire day. This is basically what a naval officer wants to hear about the battle. They want to learn what was going on. Intelligence reports received during the night had indicated that the enemy invasion force was retiring northward, but there was no news of the Suku and Shakaru. In the uncertainty whether the Japanese carriers were to the eastward or westward, it was necessary to carry out a 360-degree search, and at 0625, about half an hour before sunrise, the Lexington launched a scouting group of 22 aircraft to cover a radius of 200 miles in the northern and 50 miles in the southern semicircle. The enemy were all located almost by chance. At 0820, just as one of the scouts was turning for home, he sighted a carrier hidden in rain squalls. The scout keyed the report to his ship on voice frequency, but a slipping generator clutch prevented receipt. However, the scouts of the adjoining sector, to whom he had made a voice report, relayed the message to Lexington and also found the enemy himself, and reported their subsequent movements. And at 0828, the news was received on board Lexington that a force of 2 carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, and some destroyers had been sighted. Position was given at 0835, latitude 1151s, longitude 156.04 east, bearing 28 degrees, distance 175 miles from the Task Force 17. The enemy carriers were standing south at high speed, and an intercepted radio transmission indicated the Japanese, in their turn, had sighted Task Force 17 almost simultaneously. The force sighted was the Japanese 6th Squadron, the so-called Port Moresby Task Force, containing, in addition to Zuko, flagship of Rear Admiral Hara, and Shakara, the cruisers Miyuka and Haguru, reinforced by 2 of the opposition occupation force cruisers and 6 destroyers. The seaplane carrier, Kyoryuki Maru, which had been encountered at Tuliga on 4th of May, belonged to this force, but if she was incompetent with the force on 8th of May, she was not sighted. Launching of attack groups by the carriers commenced at 0900 hours. The Lexington launching 24 scout bombers, 10 fighters, and 12 torpedo aircraft. Yorktown on 7 scouts and 17 bombers, all with 1,000-pound bombs, 6 escort fighters, and 9 torpedo aircraft with torpedoes set to run at 10 feet. Now, of course, we always do count about how much more powerful the American and air groups are compared to their British counterparts. But both of these carriers are launching air attacks, in one case of 46 aircraft, and in the other of 36 aircraft. No, 43 aircraft. So, in terms of operationability, they're actually quite acceptable compared to some of the later war. They're equivalent to some of the Royal Navy designs. Because, of course, the American carrier air groups often included the stored aircraft, which were platted up in their wings, in their hangars. It affects things. It's the operational aircraft which really do matter. The British stuck their spare aircraft on escort carriers or on HMS Unicorn. It's a different operating style. These attacks are fairly strong and they're heading for the target, and they do quite well. But for more, please do go read this book. It's a really, really cool book. I also have their book on the conflict in the Mediterranean, and that's also very, very good. The battle summaries are cool. Now, final, 4th book, and we're going to be running over the 15 minutes, is Clark G. Reynolds, The Fast Carriers, The Forging of the Air Navy. I like this book because it starts off with a comment to my patient wife, Connie, and I'm sure she was patient. But also because Reynolds gives such a wonderful story through this. Yes, there are books which have come which are newer, which have more detail, which are considered more accurate, but this one is a very good story. It's a very good history to read. It gives you a very nice overview, and if you want the more precise facts and data, go find some of the newer books. They're precise and obsessive with preciseness. But this is well read, and there you go, there's my bookmark. Rapid completion of carriers, then building, was what Nimitz wanted, but the airmen and Admiral Horn also had post-war concerns. On 17th August, Admiral Fitch informed Horn that the post-war Navy needed 3 battle, 11 heavy, and 17 escort carriers. But 35 carriers in commission or building at the beginning of the summer seemed insufficient. Consequently, during the summer, Navy contracted shipbuilders laid down 3 more Essexes, another Midway battle carrier, and 2 light carriers of a new Saipan class. As late as January 1945, 1 more Essex was laid down. The aviators would one day have a stockpile of no less than 41 attack carriers, including the Old Ranger, from which to scale down into a respectable post-war fleet. One may conclude the obvious, that the admirals were cheating on their wartime budget to build ships which would never fight Japan, but they were realistic in their assumptions that public interest and hence congressional appropriations would drop to the usual post-war lows, and the Navy would need to maintain up-to-date ships in adequate numbers during such lean years. The hearings of Senator C.A. Woodrum's Select Committee on Post-War Military Policy during the spring of 1944 already suggested the growing movement of the Army Air Forces to compete with the post-war Naval Air Force. Typical Navy silence led to the formulation of 2 tentative Navy demobilization plans in May and June without consultation with the other services. But in fact, the entire Navy approach to its post-war requirements, beginning with the earlier Yarnell study, pointed up the general uncertainty throughout the Navy about its future. With this lack of direction in mind, on the 22nd of October 1944, Admiral King turned over all post-war planning to his new deputy, Comich CNO Vice Admiral Edwards, and specifically to his planning officer, Rear Admiral Duncan. These 2 men initiated a systematic study of the Navy's post-war requirements. With the anticipated limitations of such a fleet, priorities were to be established. These priorities were fast carriers and escort carriers, then battleships. Consequently, Airman Duncan was key man for the task. This is a really cool book. It's got lovely pictures in, as of all these books actually, and it's well worth reading. So, that's Fast Carriers by Clark G. Reynolds. And that is really over time for four random books. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you. Take care.